In the silence that follows complete darkness lies a truth that cannot be denied. Not the familiar absence of light that settles gently at dusk on a summer evening, not the inconvenience of a temporary power failure that disrupts a single night's plans. This is something far more consequential, something that signals the unraveling of occupation, the collapse of strategic vision, the systematic dismantling of what was meant to be an impregnable fortress. What Ukraine accomplished during the early hours of June 24, 2026, stands without parallel in modern military operations. The entire city of Sevastopol, positioned as the vital centerpiece of Russian dominance across Crimea, was plunged into an absolute blackout. This was no coincidental effect of conflicting military maneuvers. This was not collateral damage from a broader offensive. This represented the culminating blow of a campaign so sophisticated in its conception, so lethal in its application, that military strategists across the globe are scrambling to identify any historical comparison. This is the account of how Ukraine has transformed Crimea into something isolated, something increasingly detached from the Russian sphere of control. And it begins with understanding that when those lights extinguished on that June evening, the prospects for their restoration have become devastatingly uncertain for those occupying the peninsula. The story demands examination because what Ukraine has orchestrated stands as one of the most strategically significant operations of the entire conflict, a masterclass in modern warfare where precision and coordination have replaced brute force as the weapon of consequence. To understand the gravity of what occurred, one must first comprehend the target itself. Sevastopol carries with it the weight of history, the accumulated significance of centuries of naval dominance and military prestige. It emerged as Russia's greatest prize when the Crimean Peninsula was seized in 2014, a symbol not merely of territorial acquisition, but of restored Russian power in a region that had once slipped from its grasp. The city represented the jewel in Russia's military crown, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, the forward operating base from which Moscow projected its influence across the Mediterranean corridor and beyond. For more than a decade, the Kremlin invested enormous resources into transforming Sevastopol into an impregnable bastion, fortifying its defenses, expanding its infrastructure, and positioning it as the operational heart of Russia's entire southern military architecture. Then something shifted. Ukraine's military leadership recognized that dominance at sea had become an achievable objective, not a distant dream. Over the course of 3 years, methodically and with remarkable precision, Kiev's armed forces systematically dismantled Russia's naval presence in the Black Sea. Vessel after vessel fell to Ukrainian ingenuity and courage. The fleet that had once seemed invincible was forced into retreat. The waters that once protected Russia's crown jewel had become a danger zone. The city that had seemed untouchable transformed into a target ripe for strategic exploitation. When Ukrainian forces struck on that June evening, they did so with full knowledge that Sevastopol had become vulnerable in ways that Moscow had refused to acknowledge publicly. The campaign began with striking precision at the Balaklava thermal power plant, one of the limited number of functioning electrical generation facilities distributed across the entire Crimean Peninsula. The strike achieved its objective with devastating effectiveness. Power cascaded outward across the city in a domino effect of darkness, yet the assault extended far beyond a single target. Monitoring channels captured evidence of simultaneous strikes against infrastructure in Kerch, against installations in Bakhchisarai, and against radar facilities nestled near Mount Petri, systems belonging to Russian air defense units. Within the span of hours, Ukraine had struck military installations, power generation capacity, and command and control nodes in an orchestrated sequence designed to overwhelm defenses already stretched to their limits. This was a calculated display of military capability, a carefully choreographed message that required no translation. The response from Mikhail Razvozhayev, the Moscow-appointed administrator of Sevastopol, sought to contain the narrative damage through telegram, claiming that Russian air defense systems had successfully repelled Ukrainian strikes and destroyed 70 unmanned aircraft. The statement, however, contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. In the very same breath, he was compelled to acknowledge that entire districts within Sevastopol, the Leninsky and Gagarinsky neighborhoods, along with numerous streets throughout the city, remained without power due to the strikes his own words had described as having been stopped. The contradiction sits uncomfortably at the heart of his messaging, revealing the chasm between what officials claim occurred and what the civilian population actually experiences. You cannot simultaneously repel an attack and suffer from its consequences. Language cannot override physical reality. At the Daily Brief, we deal exclusively in what actually happened, not in what authorities claim happened, and the actual situation was far more dire than any official statement suggested. The Crimean Peninsula had already begun deteriorating before June 24th arrived to deliver the final blow. The day immediately preceding, on June 23rd, rolling blackouts had already commenced across extensive portions of the peninsula as authorities scrambled to manage diminishing capacity. Oleg Khrushchev, serving as a spokesperson for the Russian Occupation Administration, made a public statement that inadvertently revealed the true state of affairs, stating with clear acknowledgement that almost daily attacks were being conducted against Crimea's energy infrastructure, that power was being redistributed across the region through constant maneuvering, and that preventive load-shedding schedules had been put into operation. He noted that these rotating blackouts would continue periodically depending on the situation with the peninsula's power grid. The phrase resonates with particular weight, almost daily attacks. These were not isolated incidents. These were sustained, recurring blows to critical infrastructure. The blackouts implemented on June 23rd followed immediately after a Ukrainian strike had destroyed fuel storage facilities at the Kerch thermal power plant. Ukraine had already begun dismantling the peninsula's ability to sustain itself before delivering what would amount to a killing stroke the following evening. By the moment when Balaklava went dark, Crimea was already dependent on life support systems that were themselves under assault. The blackout of June 24th amounted to little more than disconnecting the life support apparatus. Razvozhayev made an attempt to steal the resolve of the occupied population through what can only be characterized as hollow exhortation. He declared that darkness would not break their spirit, that they had endured difficulties before and would do so again. Simultaneously, he instructed residents to preserve their mobile device batteries in case they needed to contact emergency services, an instruction that borders on absurdist theater. The contradiction reaches almost unbearable levels when one considers that Russia has spent the previous 2 years employing nearly identical tactics against Ukrainian civilians, conducting systematic, deliberate campaigns to destroy the power infrastructure across Ukraine, leaving millions of Ukrainian people without heat throughout brutal winters. Russia has transformed the targeting of civilian energy infrastructure into its signature weapon, its preferred method of inflicting suffering on non-combatants. Now that the tables have turned, now that Russia's own occupation population finds itself experiencing the conditions that Russia imposed on others, a Russian governor finds himself inadvertently instructing civilians in the art of survival without electrical power, lessons learned from Ukraine's own experience. The inversion is almost comical in its symmetry, except for the very real suffering involved. Before delving into the precise tactical execution of what Ukraine accomplished, it becomes essential to understand that the blackout represented merely the crescendo of a week-long campaign, the final thunderous note of an orchestra that had been performing at increasing intensity for days. The numbers alone convey the scope of what has transpired. According to Mikhailo Fedorov, Ukraine's Minister of Defense, the nation's defense ministry contracted 300% more mid-range strike drones in the initial 4 months of 2026 compared to the entirety of the previous year. 300%. The magnitude cannot be overstated. In an interview granted to the Kyiv Independent on June 17th, Fedorov spoke without ambiguity about the imminent consequences. He described Crimea as undergoing systematic isolation through drone operations, predicted that the peninsula would soon become effectively detached from mainland logistics, and warned that such isolation would generate severe repercussions for Russian interests. He characterized it as a logistics lockdown, and he has proven to be a man of his word. The architect responsible for translating strategic objectives into operational reality is Robert Brovdy, known throughout Ukrainian military circles by the call sign Madyar, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces. Speaking from a reinforced underground position situated near active combat zones, Brovdy revealed that his teams process between 10 and 12 terabytes of intelligence data on a daily basis, information fed into artificial intelligence systems that have transformed Ukraine's targeting capabilities into something faster, more accurate, and increasingly autonomous in its execution. Since June of the previous year, the forces under his command have expanded mid-range drone operations by a factor of 28. Within merely the first 5 months of 2026, the unmanned systems forces have inflicted casualties exceeding 50,000 Russian servicemen and have destroyed 174 air defense systems representing approximately $5.4 billion in military assets. $5.4 billion in a single 5-month period. When speaking to international journalists, Brovdy articulated his strategic objective with clarity that transcends typical military terminology. He stated that his forces would generate conditions making it untenable for any military personnel or defense industry workers to remain operating within Crimea. This is not the language of a tactical commander directing specific operations. This is the vocabulary of a strategist conducting a siege, a contemporary siege executed not with medieval catapults and earthen fortifications, but with swarms of autonomous aircraft directed by a generation of Ukrainian warriors who have built their capabilities from nothing while fighting under constant pressure. The siege is demonstrating tangible results. According to United 24 Media, the concentration of drone operations over the critical corridor connecting Mariupol through Berdyansk and Melitopol toward Simferopol had achieved the reduction of cargo traffic by 71% within a mere 2-week period by early June. The daily flow of vehicles along this essential supply artery decreased from approximately 3,800 vehicles to roughly 1,100 vehicles. In response to these losses, Russia's Vostok military grouping resorted to an extraordinary measure, formally prohibiting military cargo from traveling along the R-280 Novorossiya Highway and the A-291 Tavrida Highway, instead routing military traffic onto secondary roads that themselves have come under increasingly intense drone pressure. 71% reduction in supply traffic generated purely through drone operations. The campaign that culminated on June 24th was not a single military strike, but rather a campaign layered within a larger campaign. Multiple operations conducted in close sequence designed to amplify each blow. On the night of June 22nd, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces made a public announcement via the Threads social media platform, delivered with a confidence that bordered on theatrical in its boldness. They announced that the railway bridge spanning the North Crimean Canal no longer existed. They then released footage confirming the claim. The video evidence showed drone after drone striking the span near Rozdoln, with visible destruction completely severing the rail crossing. This rail line had served as a vital conduit for Russian military personnel, supplies, equipment, and fuel moving into the peninsula. Ukraine then struck the repair machinery staged nearby to prevent rapid reconstruction, then struck the damaged site again to ensure the destruction would be permanent and costly to reverse. The Kyiv Independent confirmed both the location and the date of the attack in subsequent reporting. Al Jazeera independently verified Ukraine's claim that the bridge destruction represented one component of a broadening campaign targeting Russia's supply infrastructure into occupied Crimea. This single bridge was merely one element of a comprehensive strategy. Similar strikes had already been conducted against other river crossings and land routes connecting the peninsula to occupied territories on the mainland. Russia's carefully constructed logistics network was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. On June 21st, Ukrainian forces struck petroleum facilities in Kerch, the strategically positioned port city occupying Crimea's eastern extremity, positioned directly across the Kerch Strait from Russian territory. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, the strikes resulted in at least 4 civilian deaths and 28 wounded. but the military significance proved far more consequential than the casualty count. The Kerch oil depot absorbed direct strikes. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky personally verified the attack in public statements. Fires ignited and burned for multiple days afterward. Satellite imagery published by various monitoring organizations captured images of storage tanks engulfed in flames and the massive plume of black smoke rising above the city. On the Russian side, officials in Krasnodar Oblast, positioned immediately east of Crimea across the strait, confirmed that a separate drone strike killed personnel at an oil transfer facility and ignited fires at an oil terminal. Traffic crossing the Kerch Bridge halted. The TES terminal, a critical transshipment complex where Russia transfers liquefied natural gas and petroleum products into occupied territories, also absorbed strikes. Evidence emerged in footage published by the Supernova Plus Telegram channel. The photographic record documents what occurred. Satellite imagery confirms the fires. Russia possesses no capability to deny any aspect of these operations. That same evening of June 21st, Ukrainian forces also struck the Nasosnaya 2 electrical substation located in the Sovetski district. NASA's firm's satellites detected the fires resulting from the strike. Additional darkness spread across the peninsula before the main blackout even arrived. The campaign extended beyond Crimea itself. On June 20th, Ukrainian drones reached the Tyumen oil refinery situated in western Siberia, approximately 2,070 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This operation transcended the specific objective of isolating Crimea. Zelensky confirmed the operation and announced that it employed new drone designs manufactured by the Ukrainian company Firepoint. He stated publicly that these drones would eventually achieve ranges exceeding 3,000 kilometers and promised that Ukraine would continue targeting Russian military manufacturing facilities, petroleum storage, and gas infrastructure. The crescendo arrived in the days immediately preceding the Sevastopol Blackout. Ukrainian unmanned forces published a count documenting 60 targets engaged during an intensive operational period. Near Bayhirov, Ukrainian drones destroyed a Pantsir S-1 air defense system. In Korotny, strikes eliminated an anti-aircraft gun and an S-300 missile launcher. In Kerch, a Nebo-U radar installation was destroyed among numerous other objectives. Additionally, Ukrainian forces targeted fuel convoys traveling toward Crimea across 4 separate occupied regions. In Horlivka, within Donetsk Oblast, a fuel rail tanker was destroyed. Near Pryazovsky in Zaporizhzhia, a supply truck was eliminated. Fuel and supply convoys attempting passage through occupied southern territories were systematically intercepted. A drone pilot training facility in Debaltsev absorbed strikes. Before the June 24th blackout, Ukraine had already destroyed 23 Russian air defense assets in June alone. When Sevastopol subsequently lost power, the tempo of operations had already reached a fever pitch. The strategic dimensions of what Ukraine has accomplished demand careful analysis because it reveals something profound about the nature of modern warfare. The Atlantic Council characterized Ukraine's recent successes as reflecting an expanding capability to target Russian logistics networks operating far beyond frontline combat zones, utilizing a new generation of domestically manufactured medium-range drone systems. These platforms, produced within Ukraine itself, increasingly sophisticated in design, and being contracted at rates 3 times exceeding the previous year's volume, represent far more than weapons in the conventional sense. They embody an instrument of blockade, a siege mechanism that, while built upon ancient strategic principles, takes a form without direct historical precedent. The Kyiv Independent published analysis demonstrating that Ukraine appears to possess the sustained capacity to keep critical bridge infrastructure and other vital supply pathways in a state of permanent disruption. Satellite photography documents that damaged bridges like the Henniches crossing remain disabled, while Russian attempts to construct alternative routes themselves become targets for Ukrainian strikes. Ukraine has moved beyond simply attacking the primary routes. The forces conducting secondary and tertiary routes, the alternative pathways, the detours themselves, have come under sustained pressure. This expanding form of pressure produces profound consequences across occupied Crimea. By June 26th, the peninsula had been formally placed under a state of emergency declaration. Sergei Aksyonov, installed by Moscow as the administrative leader of occupied Crimea, made the announcement through social media channels. According to Newsweek reporting, the declaration followed the cascade of Ukrainian strikes that had devastated the energy grid, triggered widespread power loss, and imposed severe restrictions on fuel distribution across the territory. Aksyonov acknowledged in formal statements that Crimea's power supply remained in crisis condition. Fuel allocation to civilians had already been completely terminated. Aksyonov himself had announced on June 21st in a video address that fuel would henceforth be distributed exclusively to government agencies responsible for maintaining the occupation's functioning and security. This represents the Russian state openly confiscating resources from civilians to sustain its military operations, a clear indicator of a power structure in terminal decline. In Sevastopol specifically, fuel had already been restricted to 20 liters per week for private individuals before the formal emergency declaration even arrived. Supermarkets, bars, and restaurants received orders to cease operations at 8 in the evening. Ferry services that had once connected the peninsula to the mainland were canceled. Street illumination was switched off. Public gatherings were officially prohibited. One civilian interviewed by the BBC provided testimony regarding the lived experience of occupied populations, describing arriving at fuel stations where petroleum sat in storage but remained unavailable for purchase, explaining that fuel deliveries had occurred overnight, but following Aksyonov's decree, authorities had shut down distribution completely. Fuel existed, the citizen explained, but not for ordinary people, because Russia required what remained to sustain its military apparatus, and even that supply was becoming increasingly difficult to replenish. Tourism booking platforms recorded a 58% decline in reservations during the 2-week period leading up to June 22nd, according to New Voice of Ukraine. Summer camps designed for children were suspended indefinitely, with reopening dates pushed to September 1st at the earliest. Authorities imposed an official ban on nighttime operation of motorcycles, mopeds, scooters, all-terrain vehicles, and similar vehicles, officially justified as a measure to reduce acoustic interference with air defense operations because Ukrainian drones had become so constant and pervasive that any background noise threatened to compromise early warning systems. One detail stands out as particularly extraordinary and revealing. The air raid sirens, traditional acoustic warning systems, had been completely disabled. Oleg Kryuchkov explained the reasoning himself. Operating the sirens would create what he described as a madhouse, producing constant sound for approximately 22 hours per day, sounding alarm multiple times throughout each night. Ukrainian drone operations had become so unceasing, so relentless, so permanently present, that sounding warnings every time a drone approached had become physically impossible. Instead, residents received text message alerts transmitted to their mobile devices, the same devices they had been instructed to keep charged to minimal levels to reserve battery capacity for emergency communications, while simultaneously, the power grid that would normally recharge those devices remained in failure. This is what the visible mechanism of strategic breakdown looks like when observed from within. Russia had constructed a narrative around Crimea as a symbol of permanence, a territory where Russian sovereignty had been restored and made irreversible, a destination for tourism and leisure, a military stronghold, a source of national pride and historical vindication. That narrative has collapsed completely. Dr. Jenny Mathers of Aberystwyth University, cited by Newsweek, characterized Russia's emergency declaration as perhaps the most significant indicator yet of the devastating effectiveness of Ukraine's extensive and methodical drone campaigns targeting critical infrastructure. She elaborated that Ukraine's strategy fundamentally undermines Putin's messaging efforts designed to shield the Russian population, including those who had migrated to occupied Crimea as tourists or residents, from the impacts of warfare. The emergency declaration she observed reveals the falseness of Putin's repeated claims that Russian forces are advancing on all fronts. Putin had held public press conferences claiming that Russian troops were nearing the city of Kostiantynivka, announcing progress and forward momentum. Yet in Crimea, the peninsula that has served as Putin's personal connection to power since 2014, the situation tells an entirely different story. Gasoline stations stand empty. Electricity remains unavailable. Bridges lie destroyed and impassable. Drones arrive continuously and without interruption. A formal emergency has been declared. The prediction issued by Brovdi, transmitted via telegram on June 23rd before the blackout itself occurred, deserves to be heard in its complete formulation. Moscow will go down in Crimea, he wrote. The SBU birds will keep doing their part. This statement was made before Sevastopol experienced any power loss. Following the subsequent blackout, Russia's occupation authority understands that Brovdi meant every word he expressed. According to CBS News reporting, Zelensky announced a 40-day influence operation specifically designed to pressure Russia into ending its war. The number 40, the structured time frame, these details signal that the Crimea campaign represents far more than a series of random strikes timed without coordination. This operation constitutes a component of a coherent, systematically escalating campaign designed to render Russia's war unwinnable. Not merely on the conventional military battlefield, but across economic channels, through logistics collapse, and in the psychological domain where occupied populations lose faith in their occupiers' capacity to sustain them. Understanding what makes Ukraine's approach so devastating requires examining its fundamental mechanics. Victory does not require massive conventional battles. Liberating Crimea will not demand a full-scale infantry assault storming the peninsula. What Ukraine has recognized is that Russia can be defeated through a different mechanism, rendering Crimea ungovernable, making it unsustainable logistically, and creating conditions where occupation becomes untenable. One drone strike follows another. Fuel depots transform into infernos. Bridges collapse into rivers. Power plants go dark. Each individual action, multiplied across time, across locations, across target categories, produces cumulative effects that exceed the impact of any single operation. The Kyiv independence analysis confirmed that Russia has been compelled to formally prohibit military cargo from utilizing its own highways, a shocking admission that the primary arteries through which supplies must flow are no longer reliable or safe. Ukraine has achieved not physical control over those roads, not the ability to station soldiers to physically block passage, but something more fundamental: fire control. The capability to destroy anything that moves along those routes at any moment of Ukraine's choosing. This transforms movement itself into an existential gamble for Russian supply operations. The strategic picture reaches beyond immediate military considerations. CNBC analyst Nona Seskuria articulated the broader dimensions clearly. Ukraine is fundamentally demonstrating to Russia that the costs of continuing this war only climb upward, not merely for Putin's government, but for the ordinary Russian citizens. For years, the Russian government has sent messages to its population that Crimea represents a safe zone, a territory where war would not intrude, where normal life would continue indefinitely. That narrative has crumbled completely. Russia faces not merely a military crisis, but a fuel shortage crisis, one that has emerged during the precise season when Crimea normally attracts massive numbers of Russian tourists, generating substantial revenue for the occupation infrastructure. Instead, beaches remain deserted, children's camps stand closed, restaurants shut before evening meals, lights do not turn on when darkness arrives. What is unfolding before observers worldwide represents the beginning of the end of Russian dominance across Crimea. This is not yet liberation, not in any formal or complete sense. However, the conditions that will enable liberation are being constructed methodically, strike after strike, bridge after bridge, power installation after power installation. Ukraine's achievement in this campaign transcends tactical excellence. At its deepest level, this represents strategic vision of the highest order. By systematically destroying the infrastructure that permits Crimea to function as a coherent territory, Ukraine eliminates Russia's capacity to sustain occupation. No state apparatus can control territory without the ability to supply it. No military force can operate effectively without fuel supplies. No garrison force can endure indefinitely when subjected to continuous bombardment from weapons its defenses cannot intercept. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that it destroyed 300 Ukrainian drones during a single night of operations. That identical night, Ukraine struck Sevastopol into complete darkness and maintained that darkness. The mathematics of the situation resolves itself. For 12 years, Russia has maintained control over Crimea. Within the span of 7 days in June of 2026, Ukraine has inflicted more fundamental strategic damage to Russia's position in that territory than had occurred during the entire previous period of occupation. The assessment emerges consistent from every analytical source: the Kyiv Independent, the Atlantic Council, Al Jazeera, Newsweek, CNBC. Crimea is in systemic crisis. Russian logistics infrastructure is fracturing under sustained pressure. The occupation faces existential threats to its continuation. Brovdi has made unambiguous statements that what has been demonstrated so far represents merely the opening phase of what is yet to come. The SBU birds will continue executing their assignments. The drones will arrive in continuous waves. Bridges will be struck repeatedly. Fuel storage facilities will burn. The electrical power that Sevastopol's governor insists his city will somehow endure losing will continue to vanish into darkness. Russia's enterprise in Crimea has reached its conclusion. Putin simply has not yet articulated that acknowledgement publicly. This is the account of how Ukraine extinguished the lights in Sevastopol, not as an instrument of terror, not to create panic among civilian populations, but as a calculated strategic communication directed at an occupying military force. Your continued presence here has become temporarily limited, and nothing within your capacity permits you to reverse this development.